11 motorcycles. One highway. A little girl standing in the middle of the road in the dark. She wasn't lost. She wasn't scared. She was the last line between her family and death. And she knew it. Nobody was coming to save them. Not the neighbors, not the police, not the warm, comfortable world that had already turned its back on them 100 times before. So she stood in front of the storm and stopped the most dangerous thing she could find. What happened next broke the internet, and broke every man in that motorcycle club in ways none of them expected. Stay until the end, because this story will stay with you long after it's over. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I read every single one. Let's go. The rain started the way bad things always do in eastern Tennessee. Quietly, then all at once. By 9 o'clock on that October night, Route 11W had turned into something barely worth calling a road. Water sheeted across the asphalt in moving silver curtains. The tree line on both sides had gone black and shapeless, just mass and darkness pressing against the narrow corridor of wet highway. Visibility was maybe 40 feet if you were lucky, maybe 30 if you weren't. Rhett Mercer had been riding in worse conditions than this for going on 16 years. His Harley Road King was 22 years old, rebuilt 3 times, and carried more scar tissue on its frame than most men carried on their bodies. He rode it like an extension of himself. Weight shifting without thinking, throttle adjustments happening somewhere below conscious thought, the machine and the man operating with the kind of mutual understanding that only comes from shared suffering. Behind him, 10 more bikes held tight formation. Not racing, not showing off, moving the way the Iron Wolves always moved when the weather turned mean, deliberate, close, and silent except for the low, rolling thunder of 11 engines doing serious work against the storm. Rhett felt the cold through every layer he was wearing. Soaked leather pressed against soaked denim, pressed against skin that hadn't been properly warmed since sometime in September. He hadn't complained about it. Nobody behind him had either. That wasn't how the Wolves operated. You rode until you stopped. You stopped when there was a reason to stop. Everything else was just weather. He was 44 years old. The crow's feet around his eyes had turned into something deeper over the past few years. Not age lines so much as erosion, the kind of wearing down that happens to rock faces on coastlines, slow and permanent and indifferent to whether you noticed. His beard had gone gray at the edges. His hands, wrapped around the grips, were the hands of a man who had spent decades pulling weight, physically, mechanically, emotionally, and they showed it. Knuckles enlarged, fingers slightly crooked from old brakes never properly set. The kind of hands that made people in gas stations step back without knowing why. He didn't mind that. He had stopped minding it a long time ago. The lights of Knoxville proper were somewhere behind them, blurred to nothing by the rain. They'd come out this direction after a chapter meeting that had run 3 hours longer than anyone wanted, sorting through the kind of club business that had nothing cinematic about it. Insurance on the garage they ran out of the industrial strip on Merchant Drive. A disagreement about road dues. Somebody's cousin who needed work and maybe couldn't be trusted. Normal problems dressed up in leather and chrome. Rhett had been road captain for 6 years. Before that, he'd been a lot of things. Paramedic, husband, father. None of those identities had survived intact. Road captain had. He wasn't sure what that said about him, and on most nights he didn't examine it closely enough to find out. Then his headlight found her. His hand squeezed the brake before his brain had fully processed what his eyes were reporting. The Road King slowed hard. Behind him, 10 riders read his body language and slowed with him, the formation compressing like an accordion, engines dropping from road roar to idle grumble, bikes angling slightly as riders put feet down against the wet asphalt. She was standing in the middle of the road. Center lane. Both lanes, actually. Route 11W out here was barely 2 lanes wide, and she was standing in the dividing line like she'd measured it deliberately. 9 years old, maybe. Maybe younger. She was small, the kind of small that makes you immediately recalculate everything. Yellow raincoat, the cheap plastic kind that gas stations sell for $4 during festival season. Hood up but doing almost nothing against rain this heavy. Her face was streaming water. White sneakers on her feet, the kind with Velcro straps, soaked dark gray. She wasn't moving, wasn't flinching from the headlights, wasn't doing any of the things a child in the middle of a highway in a rainstorm at night should be doing. She was just standing there, watching Rhett with eyes that were somehow completely calm. That calm was the thing that got him. Fear he knew how to read. Panic he knew how to manage. This wasn't either of those things. He cut the engine. Behind him, engines died one by one in a rippling chain of silence that left only rain. For a moment, nobody moved. 11 men on 11 motorcycles sitting in the dark and the rain, staring at a small girl who stared back without blinking. Rhett put his kickstand down and got off the bike. He was 6'2", 230 pounds of road-weathered, storm-soaked, leather-jacketed ex-first responder walking toward a child in the middle of a highway, and he was aware of exactly how that looked. He slowed his pace, kept his hands visible, crouched slightly as he got closer to bring himself down toward her level. She still didn't move. Up close, her eyes were green. Not the bright performative green of people who got complimented on their eye color, but something older, more exhausted, a color that looked like it had already seen too much of what life actually contained. "Hey," Rhett said. He had to speak loudly over the rain, but he kept his voice as level as he could. "You okay?" She didn't answer immediately. She was looking at him the way children sometimes look at adults, when they're deciding whether the adult can actually be trusted or whether trust will just make things worse. A calculation that should take years to develop, that some kids learn to make at an age that has no business producing that kind of judgment. Then she moved. She pulled back the edge of her soaked blanket, and Rhett went completely still. She was holding a newborn baby, wrapped in whatever she'd been able to find, tucked against her chest under the raincoat, kept against her body heat by sheer determined proximity. The baby was tiny, premature tiny, the kind of size that hits your chest like a physical thing if you've ever worked in emergency services. Moving, breathing, making small working sounds against the cold and the wet. "My mom is dying," the girl said. 3 seconds of silence, rain hammering everything around them. "Where?" Rhett said. 3 blocks. She pointed back down the road into the dark. "The White House. She won't wake up." Behind Rhett, somebody's boot scraped asphalt. He heard Decker, his VP, 20 years of road and 3 tours in places nobody talked about at dinner, exhale slowly. That exhale contained everything: recognition, weight, the specific gravity of a situation that has just changed from bad weather to something else entirely. "Hatch," Rhett said without turning around. "Already calling." Hatch's voice, raspy from a decade of cigarettes, was already doing what it needed to do. Calm, focused, the voice of someone giving a 911 dispatcher an address with the quiet authority of a man who has done this before. Rhett looked at the girl. "What's your name?" "Ruby." "Ruby, how old is your brother?" A flicker across her face, surprise that he'd assumed the baby's gender correctly, then something that might have been relief at being read accurately. "He doesn't have a name yet. He came too early." "How long ago?" "Maybe 2 hours." A pause. "I don't have a phone. The neighbor on the left has a dog that bites. The neighbor on the right didn't answer." She said this without self-pity, without drama. Pure logistics. "You were the first moving thing I saw." Rhett looked at her for one long moment, at the yellow raincoat and the soaked sneakers and the baby she was holding with a steadiness that no 9-year-old should have to possess, and felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not an easy shift, not warm or welcome. The kind of shift that happens when something that has been locked down for years suddenly doesn't have enough structural integrity to stay locked. He stood up straight. "Decker, Hatch, Santos. With me." He looked at Ruby. "Can you show me?" She nodded once and started walking. The house was a white, single-story, maybe 800 square feet total, the kind of house that had been built for function and had never gotten upgraded to anything approaching comfort. One front porch light, the bulb half dead and flickering. Gutters pulling away from the roof line. A front step that moved under weight in a way that suggested the wood beneath was rotted. The door was unlocked. Ruby pushed it open and led Rhett inside without ceremony. The smell hit him first. Blood. That was the dominant note, copper sharp and unmistakable. The smell that had lived in his nightmares and his memory in equal measure for going on 15 years. Under it, the close, warm smell of a small house in winter. The ghost of something cooked hours ago. Cheap candles, damp fabric, and fear. Fear has a smell that most people don't know how to name, but that anyone who's worked emergency scenes can identify the same way you can identify wood smoke or rain. It's in the air before you can see the source. The woman was on the floor of the hallway, between the small bathroom and what looked like the only bedroom. She was younger than Rhett expected. Late 20s, maybe early 30s, with dark hair plastered against pale skin and a stillness that was several degrees more alarming than unconsciousness. He moved to her immediately, dropping to one knee, 2 fingers to her neck. Pulse. There. Weak and uneven, but there. She's alive, he said, for Ruby's benefit as much as anyone else's. He heard Ruby make a sound behind him, small, controlled, the sound of someone who has been holding themselves together through force of will and just got handed a fraction of good news. Not crying, just releasing pressure, a millimeter of it. She kept holding the baby. She delivered here? Decker asked. He was already moving through the hallway, taking inventory with the same quiet efficiency he applied to everything. In the bathroom, Ruby said. She tried to call for help first, but her phone died. She said to get help, and then she fell down. Decker checked the bathroom quickly, came back. Significant blood loss, could be retained placenta, could be a tear. She needs a hospital yesterday. ETA on the ambulance? Red asked. Hatch, standing in the doorway with his phone, shook his head slightly. 12 minutes, minimum. Weather's got everything backed up. 12 minutes was not nothing. 12 minutes with this level of blood loss was a conversation Rhett had had before, in different houses, different conditions, different years, and the outcome had not always been the one anyone wanted. Santos, Rhett said. Blankets? Everything in this house, couch, bedrooms, wherever. Santos, youngest member of the Wolves, 26, and built like a utility truck, with a face that had made more than one police officer reach for a radio on site, moved without a word. He was back in 40 seconds with an armful of blankets and a look on his face that said he understood the stakes. Rhett organized the next 12 minutes the way he'd been trained to organize chaos. One decision at a time, one action at a time, no space between them for fear to get traction. He got the woman's airway clear, got her elevated slightly, the right amount, monitored her breathing, talked to her, low and steady, not because he thought she could hear him, but because maintaining a verbal presence was part of the protocol, and the protocol existed for reasons that experience had validated. Behind him, he was peripherally aware of Decker taking the baby from Ruby with something approaching gentleness. Decker, who had once broken a man's collarbone with one hand in a truck stop parking lot, holding a premature newborn with both of them and murmuring something too quiet to hear. Ruby watched him for a moment, reading him the same way she'd read Rhett on the highway, and then sat down on the floor beside her mother and took her mother's hand and waited with the patience of someone who has learned that waiting is sometimes the only available action. The ambulance arrived at 11 minutes and 40 seconds. Rhett was counting. The paramedics, 2 of them, young, moving fast against the rain, came through the door with the urgent competence of people doing their jobs under pressure, and then they stopped moving fast for exactly 2 seconds when they registered what they'd walked into. 4 men filling the small hallway. Leather jackets, cut patches. Tattoos visible at every exposed edge of skin. The Iron Wolves logo, a snarling wolf's head above a highway horizon, on the back of every vest. The taller paramedic's hand moved toward something at his belt before he caught himself. Rhett stood up slowly, hands away from his body, and spoke before the man's instincts could complete the circuit they'd started. Female, approximately 30 years old. Postpartum, significant blood loss, estimated 2 hours since delivery. Pulse has been weak and irregular, averaging around 50 over the last 10 minutes. Airway clear. She's been unconscious since we arrived. He paused. Premature infant, around 36 weeks by the size. Body temperature low. Breathing labored, but present. The 9-year-old is the patient's daughter. She's uninjured. The paramedic stared at him for a half second. Then professionalism took over the way it's supposed to take over, and they moved, and Rhett stepped back to give them room. He didn't need to be thanked. He didn't want to be thanked. He stood in the small kitchen of a stranger's house, while rain hammered the single window above the sink, and watched the paramedics work and felt the specific numbness that comes after a crisis period, that brief flat space between the emergency and whatever comes next. Ruby appeared beside him. He hadn't heard her move. She was looking at her mother being worked on, her face doing something complex and controlled that was too old for her face. "Is she going to be okay?" Ruby asked. Rhett thought about how to answer that. He thought about what a comfortable answer would sound like, and what an honest answer would sound like, and which one this particular child deserved. "I don't know," he said, "but she has the best chance she can have right now." Ruby considered this. "That's what real answers sound like," she said quietly. "Not the fake ones." He looked down at her. "You've gotten a lot of fake answers," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't treat it like one. "My dad left when she was pregnant," Ruby said, her eyes still on her mother. "He gave a lot of fake answers before he left." She said it the way you say things you've already processed as much as you're going to process them. Not without feeling, but with the feeling properly filed, put somewhere it doesn't leak all over everything else. The kind of emotional containment that most adults spend years trying to develop and rarely achieve. Rhett said nothing. He wasn't sure there was anything to say. He stood beside her in the cramped kitchen that smelled like old rain and copper and fear, and the paramedics worked in the hallway, and outside, through the walls, he could hear the rain beginning, finally, impossibly, to ease. When they moved her mother to the stretcher, Ruby stood up straight. She looked at Rhett one more time. "Will you come to the hospital?" she asked. He had 11 men outside who were wet and cold, and had already done more than anyone could reasonably ask of them on a night off. He had a chapter to answer to, and a road back to Knoxville, and a bed that was, while not particularly comfortable, at least dry. He had approximately no obligation to this family that he had known for less than an hour. "Yeah," he said. "We'll be there." 9 men stood in the rain outside while Rhett and Decker rode behind the ambulance. Nobody complained about it. Nobody said anything about it. That was the thing about the wolves that the people who looked at their jackets and their faces and saw criminals could never see, never wanted to see. They showed up. Whatever else was true about them, whatever they were running from, whatever damage they carried, they showed up. The hospital waiting room was fluorescent lit and half full, and immediately, conspicuously aware of them the moment they walked in. People pulled their children slightly closer without making it obvious. A woman in the corner moved her purse to her lap. A man in a business shirt, waiting alone with a paper coffee cup, shifted his body angle away from them in the way people do when they're trying to signal non-engagement without admitting they're afraid. Rhett felt every single one of those adjustments. 16 years of the same thing, and he still felt each one. He sat down in the orange plastic chair nearest the door. Decker sat beside him. The others arranged themselves around the room with the quiet, unconscious territorial instinct of men who are accustomed to not being entirely welcome wherever they are. Ruby sat down next to Rhett, not next to Decker, not in the empty row across the room, next to Rhett, close enough that her small shoulder was within an inch of his arm, in the specific way that children position themselves near adults they've decided to trust without yet knowing why. He didn't say anything about it. He looked at the floor. Outside, the rain hammered the hospital windows in the last of its fury, and down the hallway somewhere, in rooms nobody in the waiting area was cleared to enter. Doctors were working on a woman who had almost died in her own hallway, and a premature baby was under lights in a NICU isolette. And somewhere in all of that was a question nobody had asked yet. What happens to Ruby tonight? And beneath that question, the one that had been forming in Rhett Mercer's chest since the moment he'd seen her standing in the highway with a newborn pressed against her body in the freezing rain. Who has been taking care of this child? He didn't have the answer, but sitting there in the fluorescent glare, with 11 battered men spread around the waiting room and a little girl asleep against his arm. Before the hour was out, Rhett Mercer felt something he hadn't felt in 11 years. Not peace, not yet. Something rawer than that. The specific, dangerous, unwelcome feeling of beginning to care about what happened to someone else. The last time he'd felt that, he'd lost everything. And somewhere in the back of that darkening waiting room, a nurse he hadn't noticed yet was watching the Iron Wolves with an expression nobody in the group had registered, and she was already picking up her phone, not to call for security, but to call the one person who would make everything about this night suddenly, catastrophically complicated. The nurse's name was Carol Briggs. Rhett didn't know that yet. He wouldn't know it for another 20 minutes, and by the time he did, the damage would already be in motion. She was mid-50s, The kind of mid-50s that comes from decades of night shifts and bad cafeteria coffee, and the specific emotional compression that happens to people who spend their lives adjacent to suffering without being permitted to fully absorb it. Her hair was pulled back tight, her scrubs were blue. She had the practiced neutral expression of someone who had learned to keep her face professionally blank, while her mind did something else entirely. Rhett noticed her the way he noticed most things in a room. Peripherally, categorically, filed under potential variable without moving to active concern. She was standing at the nurse's station at the far end of the waiting area, one hand resting on the counter, the other holding her phone at a specific angle that suggested she was not reading a text but composing one. He looked away. Beside him, Ruby had gone to sleep with the sudden completeness of children who have been running on pure adrenaline and finally hit the wall, one moment upright, the next tilted at 15 degrees against Rhett's arm, breathing slow and even. Her yellow raincoat was still on. It had left a damp patch on her seat and a smaller damp patch on Rhett's sleeve where she'd leaned into him. He didn't move his arm. Across the room, Decker was awake, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor with the 1,000-yard focus of a man reviewing internal footage. Santos had found a vending machine somewhere down the hall and come back with a paper cup of coffee that smelled like it had been brewed sometime during the previous administration. He held it without drinking it, turning it slowly in both hands, the steam rising in a thin curl under the fluorescent lights. Hatch was the only one who looked genuinely at ease, which was either a testament to his constitution or a warning sign, depending on how well you knew him. He had his arms crossed, eyes half closed, head tipped back against the wall. The Iron Wolf's patch on his chest rose and fell with slow, controlled breaths. He looked like a man who had made peace with waiting the same way other men make peace with weather. Not by liking it, but by deciding it didn't require a response. Nobody was talking. That was normal for the wolves in a waiting room. It would have read as hostility to the people stealing glances at them from across the orange plastic chairs, but it wasn't. It was the specific, comfortable silence of men who had learned that most communication worth having didn't require words, and that the words people used in situations like this, "She'll be fine, don't worry, it's going to be okay," were mostly noise manufactured to push discomfort into someone else's hands. The woman in the corner with the purse on her lap had been replaced by a different woman who did the same thing with her purse. The man with the paper coffee cup had left. New people had filtered in, done the same quick recalculation at the sight of the leather and the patches, positioned themselves at the maximum comfortable distance. The waiting room had its own ecosystem, its own cold social logic, and the Iron Wolves occupied it like a weather system. Acknowledged, adjusted for, not engaged. It was Decker who broke the silence. He didn't look up from the floor when he did it. "You know, this can't be a regular thing," he said. His voice was low enough that only Rhett would hear it clearly. Rhett kept his eyes on the middle distance and said nothing, which Decker read correctly as keep talking. "The chapter's already asking questions on the thread. Moss wants to know why 9 of us are sitting in a hospital on a Wednesday night." "Moss can want whatever he wants," Rhett said. "Moss is the treasurer and he's got 3 guys who already think you run this club like a personal project." Decker finally looked up. His eyes were dark and flat in the fluorescent light. Not unkind, but carrying the weight of a man who had already thought this conversation through from multiple angles before starting it. "I'm not disagreeing with tonight. I'm saying tonight has a morning attached to it." Rhett looked at him for a moment. "The kid has nobody." "You don't know that yet." "I know enough." "You know what you saw in the last 2 hours," Decker said carefully. "That's not the same thing." The not the same thing landed with a specific weight, because they both knew what it referred to. Not Ruby, not tonight. Something older. A pattern that Decker had watched develop over 16 years with the particular wary attention of a man who loves someone and has watched that someone make the same mistake from different angles repeatedly. Rhett's jaw tightened. A muscle near his ear moved once and stopped. "Don't," he said. "I'm not doing anything." "You're about to." Decker held his gaze for 3 seconds, then looked back at the floor. "I just need to know you're thinking with your head." "I'm always thinking with my head." "No," Decker said. "Sometimes you're thinking with the part of you that's been trying to save the wrong people since Emma died, and I never say anything about it because it's not my grief to manage. But tonight feels different." Emma. The name sat in the air between them like a physical thing. Neither of them looked at it directly. Ruby shifted in her sleep against Rhett's arm, a small, unconscious adjustment, her breathing unchanged. He waited until she'd settled again before he answered. "Get some sleep, Deck." Decker didn't answer. He went back to looking at the floor, but the shape of his silence had changed. Less open, more resigned. The silence of a man who has said the necessary thing and now has to wait and see whether it mattered. Rhett stared at the wall across from him. Emma had been 7 years old. A Tuesday morning in March. A secondary road outside of Maryville, a rain that was less severe than tonight's, a driver who had run a stop sign at 40 miles an hour and never been able to explain afterward why he hadn't seen it. Rhett had been working. An EMT rotation, first vehicle on scene, radio code dispatched without anyone knowing the vehicle involved contained his daughter and his wife, driving to piano lessons. His wife, Claire, had been released from the hospital after 11 days. She had not been able to remain married to a man who kept showing up to trauma scenes every 48 hours after their daughter's death. He understood that. He had never blamed her for it. He had signed the papers she brought him without discussion, because discussing it would have required him to articulate something about his own culpability in staying on the job, in needing the job, needing the structure and the certainty of the protocol, that he was not equipped to articulate and probably never would be. He thought about Emma maybe 30 times a day. He had learned to carry it the way you learn to carry an injury that won't heal and won't kill you, constantly, carefully, aware of every movement that might aggravate it. Ruby's shoulder was warm against his arm. He looked at the ceiling and thought about absolutely nothing for a while, which was its own kind of discipline. It was 40 minutes after they arrived that Carol Briggs moved. Rhett clocked it in his peripheral vision. She had finished whatever she was composing on her phone, spoken briefly to a colleague behind the station, and was now walking in the direction of the waiting room entrance. Not toward him. Not toward the wolves. Toward the exit, quickly, with the purposeful stride of someone who has completed the action they came to complete and is now simply going elsewhere. He watched her badge swing on its lanyard as she pushed through the door. Something in his stomach went quiet and cold. He looked at Hatch. Hatch, eyes still half closed, said without moving, "I saw her." "What do you read?" A pause. "Nothing good." Rhett didn't move. Ruby was asleep against him, and he didn't have information yet, and acting without information was the province of people who confused urgency with usefulness. He'd learned that distinction in his first year as an EMT and had applied it ever since to situations that had nothing to do with medicine. He waited. The doctor came out 40 minutes later. A woman, early 40s, with the efficient compassion of someone who has delivered uncertain news enough times to have developed an architecture for it. The measured eye contact, the slight forward lean, the hands kept visible and still. "Ms. Calloway's family?" she said. Everyone in the waiting room looked at the iron wolves. Rhett stood up carefully, extracting himself from Ruby's weight without waking her, and crossed the room. "Road captain, we brought her in. The daughter's asleep over there." The doctor looked at him for a moment. He watched her run the same calculation everyone ran: leather, patches, size, ink, and he watched her land, as the good ones usually did, on the side of person first, appearance second. "She's stable," the doctor said. "Postpartum hemorrhage. We got ahead of it. She's going to need recovery time, and she'll be in observation for at least 2 days, but she's going to be okay." The breath Rhett let out was not dramatic. It was quiet and complete, the way real relief actually moves through a body. Not a sigh so much as a structural release, something that had been held at tension dropping back to baseline. "The baby?" "In the NICU. Premature but responding well. He's small, but he's a fighter." A pause. "We're going to need to discuss the daughter's situation. She's a minor, the mother is incapacitated, and we don't have any emergency contacts on file." "She has a father," Rhett said. "They're not together." "Do you have contact information?" "No." The doctor's expression didn't change, but her eyes moved in a way that indicated she was filing this under complication. "I'll have our social worker come speak with you." "When?" "She's on call, maybe an hour." Rhett nodded. The doctor went back through the door. He stood in the middle of the waiting room for a moment, then turned around. Ruby was awake. She was sitting upright in the orange plastic chair with her hands in her lap, and her eyes open, and from the quality of her alertness, it was impossible to tell how long she'd been awake, whether she'd caught the last 30 seconds of the conversation or the last 5 minutes of it. "My mom's okay," Rhett said. Ruby looked at him. "I heard." A beat. "What's a social worker?" He crossed back to her and sat down. Around them, the wolves had gone still in the specific way that meant they were all paying attention without appearing to. "Someone whose job is to make sure kids are in safe places," Rhett said, "and they're coming because I don't have anywhere safe to go tonight." It wasn't a question. She said it the same way she'd said everything tonight, as a piece of information being processed, not as a wound being displayed. "Your dad," Rhett said. "Do you know how to reach him?" Something crossed Ruby's face. It was the first genuinely childlike expression he'd seen from her. Not fear exactly, but the precursor to fear, the moment before a person decides whether to show you the thing they're protecting. "He doesn't—" She stopped, started again. "He has a new family. He told my mom that if she called him about money again, he'd get a lawyer." Rhett absorbed that. "He said that in front of you?" "He said it on the phone. Mom didn't know I was listening from the hallway." Her hands tightened slightly in her lap. "I'm good at being somewhere people don't notice." The waiting room hummed with its fluorescent indifference. Down the hall, somewhere past the double doors, machines were keeping track of 2 heartbeats that had almost stopped tonight. Rhett became aware of Decker beside him. The man had moved without making noise, which was something Decker did when he had something to say that he didn't want to say. "Outside," Decker said, "for a minute." The tone was not a suggestion. Rhett looked at Ruby. "Stay here. Don't go anywhere with anyone until I'm back." Ruby studied him. "Okay?" Outside the hospital entrance, the rain had finally fallen off to something light and intermittent, more memory than weather. The Harleys were lined up in the far end of the parking lot. Someone had pulled them together more tightly, probably Santos, a small unconscious act of order in a disordered night. Their chrome was wet, and the lot lights caught it in orange and white fragments. Decker pulled a cigarette from his cut pocket, lit it, and smoked in silence for a moment. The smoke rose and dispersed in the damp air. He was looking at the middle distance beyond the parking lot, where the black shapes of trees stood against a sky that was starting, imperceptibly, to lighten toward gray. "Moss called me," Decker said. "From the thread?" "Direct call, 20 minutes ago." A pull on the cigarette. The ember glowed sharp and then faded. "Someone at this hospital recognized the patches and posted about it. Facebook, local crime watch group, one of those neighborhood things." He paused. "It's already 200 shares." Rhett said nothing. Half the comments are people saying we're here to case the hospital, other half saying we strong-armed our way in with a woman we... Decker stopped. "You can imagine the rest." "I can imagine the rest." "Moss wants us gone. He called it a liability. His word." Another pull. "He's not entirely wrong from a chapter perspective. He's entirely wrong from a human perspective." Rhett. Decker looked at him directly, and the flatness in his eyes had been replaced by something more complicated. Not softness, but the specific, careful weight of a man carrying someone else's well-being alongside his own judgment. "You've got a 9-year-old girl in there who looked at you like you're the first solid thing she's touched in months. And I know what that does to you. I know exactly what that does to you. And I'm telling you that you need to be very clear-eyed right now about what you can and cannot be to this kid." The parking lot dripped. An ambulance idled at the far bay, its lights off, exhaust rising in white threads. "I'm not trying to be her father," Rhett said. "I know you're not trying to." A beat. "That's not always the part that matters." The silence between them was a different texture than the ones inside. Older, more loaded. It had the density of a conversation that had been running underground for years and was only now breaking surface, and both men were aware of it, and neither was entirely ready for it. Then Santos came through the hospital entrance behind them, and his face was wrong, not scared. Santos didn't scare easily, but tight around the eyes in the way that meant he'd received information and was processing whether to deliver it slowly or immediately, and had landed on immediately. "There's a woman inside," Santos said. "She's been talking to the nurses for the last 10 minutes. Showed up about 15 minutes ago." He looked at Rhett. "She's from Child Protective Services." Rhett frowned. Social worker's not supposed to be here for another 40 minutes. This isn't the social worker. Santos hesitated. She asked specifically about the Iron Wolves. By name. She asked who's the road captain. The night went very still. Rhett looked at Decker. Decker looked at Santos. The cigarette in Decker's hand burned down untouched, ash hanging at the tip with improbable patience. Who called her? Rhett said. Santos said nothing. He didn't need to. Rhett was already moving toward the entrance, the automatic door sliding open in front of him, the fluorescent glare swallowing him whole. Behind him, Decker dropped the cigarette and ground it under his boot and followed without being asked, because that was what Decker did. Had always done, for 20 years, whatever the cost. Inside, the waiting room had reorganized itself around a new presence. She was standing near the nurse's station, mid-40s, in a dark coat that was wet at the shoulders from the parking lot. She had a lanyard with a government-issue ID that she'd left visible on purpose, the specific performative display of official authority meant to establish a perimeter before a conversation begins. She had a clipboard. She had the particular expression of someone who has been doing a difficult job for a long time and has made their peace with being disliked. She turned when Rhett walked in. Her eyes went to the patch on his chest, then to his face. She didn't step back, which he noted. Road captain, she said. Rhett Mercer. Ms. Doherty, DCS. She didn't offer her hand. I've been asked to assess the situation involving the minor. By who? A pause. I received a concern call about 45 minutes ago regarding an unsupervised minor in the presence of a known outlaw motorcycle club. She glanced at the rest of the wolves in the room, then back to Rhett. I'm not here to make accusations. I'm here to make sure the child is safe. Rhett felt the word known land the way it was intended to, like a label, like a categorization, like a door being closed before anyone inside had gotten a chance to speak. Behind Ms. Doherty, Carol Briggs was standing at the nurse's station. She wasn't looking at her phone anymore. She was watching. And across the waiting room, Ruby Calloway was watching too. Sitting upright in her orange plastic chair with her hands in her lap, eyes moving between Rhett and the woman with the clipboard with the calculating precision of a child who has learned, the hard way, exactly what a clipboard in a waiting room at this hour usually means. Rhett looked at Ruby. Ruby looked back at him. And in her eyes was the first thing he'd seen from her that looked genuinely like fear. Not of the CPS worker, not of the situation, but of the specific possibility that this was the moment where the one solid thing she'd found tonight was going to be taken away from her. He looked back at Ms. Doherty. You want to talk about the child's safety, he said. Fine, let's talk. Mr. Mercer, she was standing alone in the middle of a state highway in a rainstorm holding a newborn baby at 9 o'clock at night, Rhett said. His voice was level, no heat in it. She had no phone, no neighbors available. Her mother was hemorrhaging on a hallway floor. She flagged down the first people she saw moving. That was us. He paused. You want to discuss who in this room represents a threat to that child? We can have that conversation. I'm happy to have it. Ms. Doherty held his gaze without blinking. I'll need to speak with her alone, she said. No, said Ruby. Everyone in the room turned. Ruby had not moved from her chair. She was sitting perfectly still, both hands in her lap, looking at Ms. Doherty with those exhausted green eyes that had seen too much and processed all of it and filed it somewhere that hurt to access. I'm not talking to you without him there, Ruby said. I don't know you. Ms. Doherty turned to her with the careful professional warmth of a woman whose job requires her to establish trust quickly in rooms full of distrust. Ruby, I understand this has been a very scary night. I'm here to help. Everyone who's ever not helped me said they were here to help. Ruby's voice was not loud. It was not emotional. It was simply precise in the way that cuts deeper than volume. He helped. He stayed. So I'm not talking to you without him there. The waiting room held its breath. Decker, standing behind Rhett's left shoulder, made no sound. Santos, near the door, made no sound. The whole room had contracted around this moment, around a 9-year-old girl in a wet yellow raincoat holding the line in an orange plastic chair. Miss Doherty looked at her clipboard, then at Rhett. Something had shifted in her expression, not softened, not convinced, but recalibrated. A woman making a professional adjustment. I'll need you to step back, she said to Rhett. Not out of the room. Just give us some space. Rhett looked at Ruby. Ruby gave him the smallest nod. He stepped back 4 feet, leaned against the wall, crossed his arms. Present, visible, not going anywhere. And as Ms. Doherty pulled a chair across the floor toward Ruby and sat down and opened her clipboard. And as the fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent hum above all of them, Rhett became aware of something he hadn't fully registered before. His phone was vibrating in his cut pocket. Not a call. The sustained intermittent pulse of multiple messages arriving in sequence. He pulled it out and looked at the screen. 8 messages, all from the same number. A number he hadn't seen in 3 years, hadn't expected to see again, had privately filed under closed. The name above the messages read Claire, his ex-wife. The first message read, I saw the Facebook post. I know where you are. The second, we need to talk about what you're doing. The third, Rhett. I mean it. Do not do what I think you're doing. And the fourth, the one that made the floor feel briefly unreliable beneath his boots. The one that made Decker, reading over his shoulder, go completely silent beside him. She has family, a grandmother. She's been looking for them for 2 months. Rhett. That little girl is not who you think she is. Rhett read the fourth message 3 times. Not because the words were complicated, because the brain, when it receives information that restructures something it thought was settled, requires repetition the way a body requires repeated impact before it acknowledges injury. The first reading lands. The second reading confirms. The third reading is where you start to understand the shape of what it means. She has family, a grandmother. She's been looking for them for 2 months. Rhett, that little girl is not who you think she is. He looked up from his phone. Across the waiting room, Miss Doherty was leaning forward in her chair, speaking quietly to Ruby in the practiced cadence of someone trained to extract information from children without the children realizing information is being extracted. Ruby was listening with her hands still in her lap and her face doing its controlled, unreadable thing. But her eyes moved once to Rhett, quick and precise, checking that he was still there, still visible, still present. He held her gaze for exactly the time it took to communicate, I'm not going anywhere, and then looked back at his phone. Decker's hand came down on his shoulder. Not grabbing, just wait. The physical equivalent of stay with me. Outside, Decker said very quietly. Ruby. Santos is here, 2 feet from her. Nothing happens to her. A pause. Outside, now. The night air was barely cooler than the fluorescent compression of the waiting room, but it felt like space, like the ability to breathe at full capacity without the awareness of being watched. Rhett walked to the edge of the entrance canopy where the pavement was still dark and wet, and he stood with his back to the hospital wall and his phone in his hand and said nothing for a moment. Decker stood in front of him, not beside. In front, the position of a man who wants to be looked at directly. Show me, Decker said. Rhett held up the phone. Decker read the messages without touching it, his eyes moving steadily left to right, his face doing nothing visible. When he was done, he straightened up and exhaled through his nose. Claire's been in contact with you for 3 years? She hasn't. This is the first. How would she know about the Facebook post that fast? She has friends in Knoxville. She always did. Rhett pocketed the phone. That's not the part that matters. What part matters? The grandmother. Ruby told me her father left, said her mother had no one. A 9-year-old doesn't lie about that. He stopped. But a 9-year-old can only tell you what she knows. Decker was quiet for a moment. The parking lot dripped. Somewhere on the far side of the building, a delivery entrance opened and closed, the metallic sound traveling clearly through the wet air. Call her back, Decker said. I know. Call her back right now before that woman inside finishes her interview and starts making decisions with incomplete information. Rhett was already dialing. Claire picked up on the second ring. He hadn't heard her voice in 3 years, and it was the same, not unchanged, but recognizably hers, carrying the particular texture of a woman who had rebuilt herself from the frame up and was still in the process of deciding what the finished version looked like. Careful, controlled, not cold. Rhett, tell me about the grandmother. A beat. I need you to understand I didn't... She stopped, started differently. I have a friend who works at Vanderbilt Children's. She's in the DCS network. When the post started circulating, she called me because she knew your patch. A pause. She shouldn't have called me. I know that. The grandmother, Rhett said again. Another beat, longer this time. Her name is Margaret Voss. She's 63. She lives outside of Cookville. She has been filing missing persons inquiries and family contact requests through the state system for 2 months, trying to locate her daughter and grandchildren. Claire's voice was steady, but the steadiness had seams in it, places where the steadiness was doing load-bearing work. Her daughter is Shannon Calloway, Ruby's mother. Rhett stared at the wet asphalt. A raindrop fell from the canopy edge and hit an inch from his boot. The mother knew where the grandmother was, he said. It wasn't a question. She knew, and she'd been preventing contact. A pause. My friend doesn't know why. She only knows that the grandmother has documentation, legal documentation, that she filed 2 months ago when the contact stopped completely. She's been working through proper channels. Another pause, heavier. She's also been working through an attorney. For what? Emergency guardianship of the children. The word children took a moment to register. Then, the baby too. Both of them. She filed before the baby was born. She knew Shannon was pregnant. She was trying to get ahead of it. Claire's voice shifted slightly. Rhett, I need you to hear me when I say that I don't know what kind of woman this grandmother is. I don't know the full situation. What I know is that DCS is going to find out about the filing within the hour, and when they do, the conversation about where Ruby goes tonight changes completely. The parking lot hummed. In the distance, one of the Harleys in the lot shifted. Thermal expansion, metal cooling, the machine making its small private sounds. Rhett watched a raindrop trace a line down the chrome of the nearest bike and thought about the fact that 30 minutes ago he had been sitting in an orange plastic chair in a fluorescent room watching a 9-year-old sleep against his arm, and the story he'd been telling himself about that moment had been simple. Simple was gone now. Why are you telling me this? He said. The silence on the phone was different from the silences in the waiting room. This one had history in it. 3 years of no contact and 11 years of accumulated weight before that, and somewhere in the specific texture of it was the answer to his question before she gave it. Because you're going to try to protect her, Claire said. And I need you to know what you're walking into before you do. He didn't answer. Rhett. I heard you. That's not the same as, I heard you, Claire. He paused. Thank you. He ended the call. Decker had been watching his face through the entire conversation with the trained attention of a man who has spent decades reading situations through the physical responses of the people in them. Now he said nothing. He waited. Get Hatch, Rhett said. Hatch materialized from near the entrance where he'd been standing with his hands in his pockets and his eyes half closed in the specific posture that meant he'd been listening to every word without appearing to. He crossed to them in 3 unhurried strides and stopped and waited. I need everything you can find on a Margaret Voss, Cookville area, 63 years old, and I need it in the next 20 minutes. Hatch's eyes sharpened. What am I looking for? Everything. Anything. Start with legal filings. Hatch pulled out his phone and walked away from them toward the far end of the parking lot without another word. Rhett looked at Decker. We need to get back inside. Wait. Decker put a hand on his arm, not stopping him, just slowing him. I need you to tell me what we're doing, not what we feel like we should do, what we're actually doing, right now, tonight. Rhett held his gaze. We're making sure that kid doesn't get handed to someone we don't know anything about in the middle of the night in a hospital waiting room because a nurse with a phone and a neighborhood Facebook group decided 11 bikers couldn't be trusted. Decker was quiet for 3 seconds. And after tonight? Ask me after tonight. He went back inside. The conversation between Ms. Doherty and Ruby appeared to have reached a phase of strategic stalemate. The woman with the clipboard had the authority and the procedure and the institutional weight of the state of Tennessee behind her. And the 9-year-old had nothing except absolute immovability and the specific unassailable logic of a child who had already survived more than the woman with the clipboard was accounting for in her assessment. Ruby looked at Rhett when he came back in. Her eyes asked a question she didn't speak. He gave her the same small nod she'd given him earlier and sat back down against the wall. Miss Doherty looked at him. Her expression had shifted, not into warmth exactly, but into something more operational. A recalibration, the way Claire had described her own adjustment. A woman revising her read. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "are you aware of any extended family connected to this child?" The question landed with the specific weight of a test. She was checking whether he knew, whether he would disclose. He met her eyes directly. "I got a call 20 minutes ago indicating there may be a grandmother in the Cookaville area, Margaret Voss. She may have active legal filings related to these children." Ms. Doherty wrote something on her clipboard. Ruby's head turned toward him with an expression he'd never seen from her before. Not the controlled processing face, not the exhausted calculation, but something rawer, younger. The face of a child who has just heard information she didn't have and doesn't know what to do with. "You know my grandma?" Ruby asked. The room went very quiet. "No," Rhett said. "I just heard her name." Ruby stared at him. "My mom said she was dead." 3 seconds of absolute stillness. Ms. Doherty's pen stopped moving. Rhett held Ruby's gaze and did not let anything show on his face, because what he was feeling was not something this child needed to see right now. The specific cold fury of a man who has just understood, in a single sentence, the scale of what a small child has been carrying without knowing she was carrying it. "She's not dead," he said. He kept his voice level, careful. "She's been looking for you." Ruby's hands, which had been so still in her lap all night, closed slowly into fists. She didn't cry. She looked down at her fists and she breathed, 1 breath, 2, with the terrible composure of a child who has already learned that crying in front of people tends to make things worse instead of better. Then she said very quietly, "My mom lied." It was not a question. It was not an accusation. It was the sound of a foundation giving way, not dramatically, not with collapse and noise, but in the slow, structural way that happens when the weight bearing down on something finally exceeds what it was built to hold. Rhett wanted to say something. He had nothing adequate. He sat with the inadequacy, which was the only honest option. It was Santos who moved first, silently, crossing from his position near the door, sitting down 2 seats from Ruby with his enormous tattooed forearms resting on his thighs and his head slightly bowed in the posture of a man who has decided that presence is its own form of offering when words fail. He didn't touch her, didn't speak to her, just reduced the distance. Ruby looked at him. Something in her face considered him, recalculated, and slowly released. That was when the doors opened and everything changed. He came through the main entrance fast, not running, but the walk that is 1 grade below running, the walk of someone who has been moving with urgency for long enough that their body has locked into it. Late 30s, business casual under a waterproof jacket that was expensive enough to notice, the kind of put together that usually costs more in maintenance than in acquisition. Dark hair still wet from the parking lot. Phone in one hand. He scanned the room once and his eyes landed on Ms. Doherty, and he crossed to her immediately, bypassing everyone else with the specific selective blindness of a man who has decided in advance what is relevant to him in a given space. "I'm Thomas Grayfield," he said to her. He had the voice of someone who expected the introduction to be sufficient. "I represent Margaret Voss. I was retained 18 months ago for the custody matter regarding the minor children of Shannon Calloway." He held out a business card without looking to see if she took it. "I drove from Cookaville. I need to know the current legal status of the children, and I need to speak with the attending physician." Ms. Doherty took the card, looked at it, looked at him. "Mr. Grayfield, I'm still in assessment. I'd ask you to give me— The emergency guardianship filing has been active since September," Grayfield said. His voice was not unkind, but it was extremely final, the voice of someone for whom courtesy and urgency have been fully integrated. "My client has been attempting to reach these children through proper channels for 8 weeks. I have documentation of every filing, every unanswered contact attempt, and 3 separate social worker referrals that were closed without follow-up because Ms. Calloway repeatedly indicated no family need." He paused. "I suspect that documentation is going to look quite different in the next few hours." Rhett had not moved from his position against the wall. He was watching Grayfield the way he watched everything, categorically, patiently, without apparent engagement, but his chest had gone tight in the specific way that preceded the recognition of danger that didn't announce itself with obvious noise. Something was wrong, not legally wrong, not procedurally wrong. Something about the man himself, the speed of his arrival, the precision of his preparation, the specific calibration of his urgency that felt less like a worried attorney responding to a crisis and more like someone who had been positioned close to this situation already. Cookeville to Knoxville was 70 miles. In a rainstorm after midnight, with the weather that had been hammering the region for the last 4 hours, the drive was 90 minutes minimum. The Facebook post had gone up less than 2 hours ago. Grayfield had either been already moving before the post existed, or he had been extraordinarily fast in a way that didn't quite compute. Hatch appeared in Rhett's peripheral vision, coming back through the entrance doors. He crossed the room without looking at Grayfield and stopped beside Rhett and spoke at a volume calibrated for Rhett's ear only. "Margaret Voss," Hatch said. "Clean record. Retired schoolteacher. Owns property in Putnam County. No flags." A pause. "But Grayfield, Thomas Grayfield, he's not a family attorney." Rhett looked at him. "He's a criminal defense attorney," Hatch said. "High end. Clients are usually not retired schoolteachers." Another pause. Hatch's voice had gone very flat. "He's also on a retainer with the Corridor Kings." The name landed like something physical. The Corridor Kings were not the Iron Wolves. They were not wounded veterans riding through personal darkness searching for something to protect. They were a different category entirely. Organized, territorial, operating through the Cumberland Plateau corridor between Nashville and Knoxville with the specific disciplined malevolence of an organization that had decided long ago that the law was a competitor rather than a constraint. The Iron Wolves had stayed out of their territory by mutual, unspoken agreement and by the shared understanding that the agreement existed because breaking it would be bad for everyone involved, most catastrophically for whichever side started it. "Why does Margaret Voss have a Kings-connected attorney?" Rhett said. "Maybe she doesn't know," Hatch said. "Maybe she picked a name from a website." He paused. "Or maybe Margaret Voss is not a retired schoolteacher who misses her grandkids." Rhett looked across the room at Ruby. Ruby was watching Grayfield with the same careful, measuring look she'd applied to everything tonight. She had heard his name. He had not looked at her yet, had not acknowledged her presence in the room, had not, in the 45 seconds since he'd entered, directed a single glance toward the child whose welfare was the stated reason for his 90-mile drive. An attorney who has been fighting for 8 weeks to locate a child walks into the room containing that child and doesn't look at her. Rhett felt the floor of the situation shift beneath him in the way it had shifted earlier when he'd read Claire's message. The structural adjustment of a man discovering that the map he's been using doesn't match the territory he's standing in. He pushed off the wall and crossed the room, not toward Grayfield, toward Ruby. He crouched down in front of her chair, same as he'd crouched on the highway, same eye level, same stillness. She looked at him with those green eyes that had processed so much tonight and were still processing, still running the calculation, still deciding. "Ruby," he said very quietly, "the man who just came in. Have you ever seen him before?" She looked at Grayfield. She looked back at Rhett. Something moved behind her eyes. A door opening onto something she'd filed away and hadn't expected to retrieve tonight. "He came to our house," she said. Rhett's jaw tightened once. "When?" 3 weeks ago. He talked to my mom on the porch. She didn't let him inside." Ruby's voice was precise and low. "She was scared after. She told me not to tell anyone a man came." "Did you hear what they talked about?" "Some of it." She hesitated. "He said she didn't have a choice. He said it was better for everyone if she cooperated." A pause. "My mom told him to get off her property, and she stood on the porch until his car left." Rhett was very still. "What kind of car?" he asked. Ruby thought. "Dark blue. Nice. There was another man in it. He didn't get out." Rhett stood up slowly. Behind him, Decker had moved without being told, standing now at an angle that put him between Grayfield's sightline and Rhett's back, hands loose at his sides, the posture of a man who has identified a variable and is managing it. Santos had shifted too. And Hatch. The small, unconscious military formation of men who have trained themselves to read a room and respond to it without a signal. Grayfield looked up from his conversation with Ms. Doherty. He looked at Rhett. Then he looked at the four men positioned around the room. His expression didn't change. That was the tell. A man who walks into a waiting room and finds four members of the Iron Wolves has a reaction, some reaction, even if it's suppressed. Fear, recognition, recalibration. Grayfield had none of those. He looked at the patches and the faces and the positions, and his expression did precisely nothing, not because he wasn't registering it, because he'd already known. "Mr. Mercer," he said. Rhett had not introduced himself to this man. The room contracted. "We should talk," Grayfield said. His voice was still the same, courteous, final, the voice of a man accustomed to conducting conversations entirely on his own terms. He gestured toward the hallway beyond the waiting room. "Privately." "I'm fine here," Rhett said. A pause. Grayfield looked at Ruby. For the first time. And the look was not the look of an attorney who has spent 8 weeks trying to locate a missing child. It was something else, an assessment, a measurement, the look of someone determining the value of an asset. Ruby felt it. Rhett saw her feel it. The slight shift backward in her chair, the tightening of her already tight hands. "Privately," Grayfield said again. His voice had not changed. The word had. Decker stepped forward one step only. But the geometry of it was unambiguous. Grayfield looked at Decker, looked at the room. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a card and held it out to Rhett. Rhett took it without looking at it. "My client's interests are best served by a cooperative transition," Grayfield said. "That benefits everyone, including the wolves." He let the words sit. Then, "I'll be at the hospital until the morning. Think about the conversation." He turned back to Ms. Doherty and resumed talking as if nothing had happened. Rhett looked at the card. It was a standard business card. Law firm name, Grayfield's name, phone number, address in Nashville. Clean, expensive stock. Nothing on it that shouldn't be on it. On the back, written in pen, in handwriting that was not Grayfield's, too hurried, different weight, a single line. "You have until 6 a.m. Then the chapter answers for the girl." Rhett's hand closed around the card. The clock on the waiting room wall read 3:47 a.m., 2 hours and 13 minutes. He turned around. Decker was right there, close enough to read his face. Rhett held up the card, back face toward Decker, and watched Decker's eyes move across the line, and watched Decker's face do what Decker's face almost never did. Go completely, entirely still, in the way that happens when a very experienced man realizes he has fundamentally underestimated the size of what he's standing in. "What does the chapter answer for mean?" Decker said. His voice was barely above a murmur. "It means someone who knows our structure wrote this," Rhett said. "Someone who knows the wolves answer to each other." "Inside?" "Or very close to it." The fluorescent lights hummed. The clock on the wall moved to 3:48. Somewhere down the corridor, behind the double doors, a machine beeped its steady confirmation that Shannon Calloway's heart was still working. Ruby looked up at Rhett from her chair. "What does it say?" she asked. He looked at her. 9 years old. Yellow raincoat still damp. Grandmother she was told was dead. Mother on a hospital bed. Baby brother under lights. A lawyer in the room who had come to her house 3 weeks ago and scared her mother badly enough that Shannon Calloway had stood on a porch and refused to move until he left. A woman who had been hemorrhaging on a hallway floor had chosen, tonight, not to call that grandmother, not to use the legal process that Grayfield claimed had been designed to help her, had chosen instead to collapse alone in a small house with no phone and let her 9-year-old daughter stand in the middle of a highway in a rainstorm with a newborn baby, rather than make one call to family. That choice had a reason, and whatever the reason was, it was connected to the man currently standing 20 feet away pretending to review paperwork, and it was connected to the card in Rhett's hand, and it was connected to a threat that had just been delivered to the road captain of the Iron Wolves in a hospital waiting room at 3:47 in the morning with a deadline of 6 a.m., which meant that someone, somewhere, had made a calculation about what Rhett Mercer would do tonight, and had decided that calculation required management. They had watched him walk into this. They had let him walk into this. They had possibly arranged for him to walk into this, From the moment a nurse named Carol Briggs picked up her phone in a hospital waiting room, all the way back to a Facebook post in a neighborhood crime watch group, all the way back to... He stopped the thought before it reached the next step, because the next step was a place he wasn't ready to go yet. Nothing important, he told Ruby. He folded the card and put it in his cut pocket and looked at Decker and said, at the same low register, "Wake everyone up, tell them nothing yet, get them outside." And then? Rhett looked at Grayfield's back, looked at Ms. Doherty's clipboard, looked at the double doors that led to the rooms where two small people who had done nothing to deserve any of this were either sleeping or fighting to exist. And then, he said, we find out who in this club has been talking to the Kings. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Because Decker, 20 years, 3 combat tours, a man who had held Rhett upright at a graveside and never once flinched at anything. Decker looked at him with an expression that Rhett had never seen on his face before. Not fear, not surprise. Guilt. Just for a fraction of a second, just long enough to be visible to someone who had spent 20 years learning to read him. Then it was gone, replaced by the flat professional stillness, and Decker nodded once and turned toward the door. And Rhett Mercer stood in a hospital waiting room at 3:48 in the morning with a threat in his pocket and a sleeping child behind him, and the slowly arriving understanding that the man he trusted most in the world had just told him something without using a single word. Rhett did not follow Decker outside immediately. He stood exactly where he was for 11 seconds. He counted them, an old EMT habit, the discipline of not moving until you have assessed what moving will cost. And he watched Decker's back as the man pushed through the hospital entrance doors and disappeared into the pre-dawn dark. 20 years. He turned that number over in his mind the way you turn a stone over to see what lives underneath it, and he felt the specific nausea of a man who has just discovered that the ground he built everything on has been hollow, in places he never thought to check. Not everything. He wasn't there yet. One expression, held for a fraction of a second, was not a confession. Men who had seen combat wore guilt on their faces for reasons that had nothing to do with the immediate situation. Old guilt, ambient guilt, the persistent low-grade culpability of people who had survived things that others hadn't. He knew that. He had that. But Decker's guilt had been specific, directional. It had pointed at something. He filed it. Not resolved, not acted on, filed, with a timestamp, in the part of his mind that kept track of variables that hadn't declared themselves yet. He crossed back to Ruby. She was watching him with the green eyes that missed nothing and asked everything without asking. "I need you to stay with Santos," Rhett said. "Right here. Don't move. Don't talk to the man in the jacket. Don't answer questions from anyone except the doctor or the nurse who was treating your mom." Ruby looked at Santos. Santos looked back at her with the steady, uncomplicated attention of a man who has been given a specific job and intends to do it completely. "Okay," Ruby said. "If anything feels wrong, I'll tell him." He held her gaze for one more second. Then he went outside. The parking lot was cold in the specific way that 4 a.m. in October is cold. Not the aggressive cold of full winter, but the cold that has given up pretending to be anything else, settled and final and without apology. His breath came out visible. His boots on the wet asphalt made the sound of boots on wet asphalt, which is one of the loneliest sounds there is, and he registered it and kept moving. The iron wolves were gathered near the bikes. Not clustered, spread, the way they spread when they were alert, each man with natural sight lines, none of them with their backs fully exposed. Old instinct, the kind of positioning that happens below the level of thought when the part of the brain that monitors threat has quietly elevated its assessment. Decker was standing slightly apart from the others. His arms were crossed. His face was the flat face, the operational face, giving nothing. Rhett stopped 6 feet from him. The other men were watching. Hatch, reading the geometry of Rhett's approach. Moss, the treasurer, who had driven over from wherever Moss went at midnight when chapter business didn't require him, standing with his phone in his hand and the expression of a man who has arrived at a scene believing he understood it and is beginning to suspect he doesn't. 3 others whose names were Patterson and Grubb, and a man everyone called Wire, for reasons that predated Rhett's road captaincy. Rhett looked at Decker. "How long?" he said. "Not what did you do, not did you betray us." He knew Decker well enough to know that the question with the most leverage was the one that assumed the answer and only asked for the dimension. Decker's jaw moved once. Rhett. How long, Deck? The parking lot held its breath. Somewhere on the far side of the hospital, a truck was reversing with its backup alarm going. That small, absurd, mundane sound threading through the silence between them. Decker unfolded his arms. He looked at the ground for exactly 2 seconds, then back up. 6 weeks. Someone behind Rhett, Patterson, from the sound of the boot movement, shifted his weight. 6 weeks, Rhett said. It wasn't... Decker stopped. Started with something that was not an excuse because Decker did not make excuses. It was one of the few things Rhett had always counted on. Grayfield approached me 6 weeks ago, said he had a client with an interest in a family situation in Knox County, said if certain information moved in certain directions, it would stay clean. Nobody would get hurt. What information? Club movements. Nothing operational, just... Decker's voice tightened at the edges. When we rode where we went, general pattern. Hatch made a sound, not a word. The kind of sound that means I knew something was wrong and finds no satisfaction in the confirmation. He was building a map, Rhett said. He was figuring out when we wouldn't be in Knoxville. I didn't know that. You didn't know because you didn't ask. Rhett's voice had gone to the place it went when he was containing something that would damage things, if not contained. Flat, controlled, each word placed with the precision of a man who understands the difference between expressing anger and deploying it. What did he give you? Decker was quiet. Deck. What did he give you? Kyle's situation. Decker's voice dropped. My nephew. The possession charge in Davidson County. It was going to be his third. It was going to be 5 years. Grayfield said he could make it administrative, no prison time. A pause so heavy it had its own gravity. Kyle's got a kid. He's 24. The parking lot breathed cold air over all of them. Rhett understood it. That was the worst part. He understood exactly how it had happened, could trace the logic of it like a man reading a map of a route he'd never intended to travel. A nephew. A kid. 5 years becoming 0 years in exchange for information that felt, from one angle, like it wasn't hurting anyone. Clean. Contained. Survivable. The Corridor Kings had done this before with other clubs. Rhett knew that. They didn't recruit enemies. They purchased small favors from people who needed them, and they waited for the small favors to accumulate into something large enough to pull on. He thought about the card in his pocket. Until 6 a.m. Then the chapter answers for the girl. They had moved the timeline up because the situation had accelerated outside their control. Ruby, in the hospital. The Iron Wolves visible and public and documented. Whatever they had planned for the orderly transfer of custody had been disrupted by 11 bikers stopping on a state highway, and they were now improvising, and improvising organizations make mistakes. That was the only useful thing in all of this. Does anyone else in the chapter have exposure? Rhett asked. No. You're certain? I'm certain. Rhett looked at him for a long time. Decker held the look. Did not look away. Did not offer anything further. Did not perform remorse, which was, in its own way, the most honest thing about the moment. Decker had done what he'd done for a reason that was human and comprehensible, and it had put every man in this parking lot in danger, and he knew it, and he was not going to reduce the weight of that by crying about it. Stand down, Rhett said. Decker blinked. What? For tonight, you're not road captain, you're not VP, you don't make calls. You stand where I can see you, and you don't act independently. A pause. After tonight, the chapter decides. That's how it works. Decker nodded once. The nod of a man accepting a judgment that he knows is accurate. Moss stepped forward. He was 51, built like a filing cabinet, with the specific unhappy energy of a man who manages other people's problems and has gotten very tired of it. Rhett, we need to pull out of this, right now, before 6 a.m. becomes a real thing instead of a threat on a card. It's already a real thing. Then we hand it to law enforcement and we go home. This is not our... She flagged us down, Rhett said. She flagged down the first thing moving. She would have flagged down a garbage truck. Then it's lucky we weren't a garbage truck. Rhett. Moss stepped closer. His voice dropped, not conspiratorial, but urgent. The voice of someone who believes he is the only sober person at the table. These people play different than we play. Kings Connected means Nashville money means people in the system. If we pick this fight, they don't come at us with fists. They come at us with lawyers and license pulls and state inspections on the garage, and I know how they come. Then you know we can't win it. Rhett looked at him. Go home, Moss, he said. Nobody's making you stay. Moss opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the other men, performing a calculation about how many of them were with him and arriving at an answer he didn't like. He pocketed his phone and walked to his bike and started it and pulled out of the lot without looking back. Wire watched him go. That's going to be a problem later. Later is later, Rhett said. Right now I need to know what we have. Hatch had his phone in both hands, working it with the focused efficiency of a man who had spent a decade finding information that other people couldn't find. Kings have 3 confirmed members in Knox County, 2 in the Cumberland corridor. Grayfield's office is in Nashville, but he keeps an apartment in West Knoxville. He paused. The woman in the hospital, Shannon Calloway. I found a name connection. Everyone looked at him. Her maiden name was Voss, Hatch said. Same as the grandmother, but she also has a middle name. Her full name is Shannon Margaret Voss Calloway. He looked up. She waitressed at a bar in Nashville called the Corridor Room from 2019 to 2021. The Corridor Room. The name didn't need elaboration. Every man in the parking lot who knew anything about King's territory knew what that bar was. It was the public-facing edge of a private operation, the place where the legitimate and the illegitimate met over drinks and pretended not to know each other. She worked for them, Patterson said. She worked near them, Hatch said. We don't know what she knew. She knew enough to run, Rhett said. She knew enough to move to Knoxville and change her name back and cut contact with her mother. He was putting it together as he spoke, the shape of it emerging the way shapes emerge from fog, not all at once, but sequentially, each piece clarifying the next. The grandmother didn't know where she was because Shannon didn't want anyone to know, including the Kings. So the Kings used the grandmother to find her, Wire said. The Kings retained Grayfield as the grandmother's attorney, Rhett said. Grandmother thinks she's got a lawyer helping her find her family. What she actually has is a GPS tracker working for the people Shannon ran from. The silence that followed was the specific silence of men who have just understood the full architecture of something and are absorbing its dimensions. Ruby had a grandmother who was probably a decent woman who genuinely wanted her grandchildren back. And that grandmother had been weaponized without her knowledge by people who wanted something from Shannon Calloway, something Shannon had either taken when she left or knew enough to threaten them with, and who had spent 8 weeks using the legal system and a loving old woman in Cookville as the mechanism for reacquiring it. What does Shannon have? Patterson asked. I don't know yet, Rhett said. But it's enough that they're willing to be visible about this. That's not small. He looked at the hospital entrance. It's also inside that building. He looked at his watch. 4:11 a.m. 1 hour and 49 minutes. Hatch, he said, I need 2 things. I need Margaret Voss's phone number, her direct number, not through Grayfield. And I need to know whether Shannon Calloway is conscious. Working on both. Patterson, Wire, you're on the entrance. Anyone comes in who you don't recognize as hospital staff, you text me before they reach the waiting room. He paused. And I mean anyone. They moved without discussion. Rhett looked at the hospital entrance for a moment. Then he went back inside. The waiting room had changed in his absence. Not dramatically, but in the small ways that indicate the passage of time and the movement of variables. Miss Doherty was on her phone near the window, her clipboard tucked under her arm, speaking in the quiet professional tone of someone reporting to a supervisor. Grayfield had moved to a row of chairs near the hallway entrance, ostensibly reviewing documents on a tablet, positioned with the specific casual precision of a man who has chosen his seat the same way a chess player chooses squares. Ruby was where he'd left her. Santos was where he'd left Santos. But Ruby's posture had changed. She was leaning slightly forward, elbows on knees, watching Grayfield with the flat, sustained attention of a child who has decided that looking away would be a mistake. Rhett sat beside her. You're back, she said. Said I would be. A pause. She didn't look at him, kept her eyes on Grayfield. The man outside, the one with the beard who was next to you. He did something wrong. Rhett looked at her. His face when you came back in, she said. He looked like my dad looked right before he left, like someone who already knows what's going to happen and is waiting for it to start. Rhett said nothing for a moment. "You're very good at reading people," he said. "My mom cried a lot when she thought I was asleep," Ruby said. "You learn to read faces when you're trying to figure out if the morning is going to be okay." She paused. "Is the morning going to be okay?" He thought about the card in his pocket. He thought about 6 a.m. He thought about a woman in a hospital bed who had run from something dangerous enough that she'd chosen a hallway floor over a phone call to her mother. "I'm working on it," he said. It was the truest thing he could offer. His phone buzzed. Hatch. "Shannon Calloway is conscious as of 20 minutes ago," nurse confirmed. "Doctor says she's stable, but they're limiting contact." Then, 10 seconds later, "Margaret Voss, number below." "Rhett. I called her. She's already on her way. She left Cookville an hour ago. She didn't call Grayfield to tell him." Rhett stared at that for a moment. Margaret Voss had left Cookville an hour ago, in the middle of the night, in the rain, without calling her attorney to inform him, which meant that either she was being cautious about Grayfield or she already knew something was wrong with the arrangement. Or, and this was the version that opened the most doors, someone else had called her. Someone who had given her a different picture of the situation than the one Grayfield had been curating. He stood up. Grayfield looked up from his tablet at the exact moment Rhett crossed the room. And the look between them was the look of two people who have been aware of each other's positions all night and are now confirming that the awareness is mutual. "The grandmother is on her way," Rhett said, not quietly, at normal volume, letting it land in the room. Grayfield's expression did not change, but his right hand, resting on the tablet, closed slightly. The knuckle of his index finger went white for half a second. There it was. "That's good news," Grayfield said. "That's what everyone wants." "Is it?" Rhett said. They looked at each other. "Mr. Mercer." Grayfield set the tablet down and stood up. And standing, he was taller than Rhett had registered. Not as tall as Rhett, but assembled with the deliberate physical authority of a man who had learned to use height as punctuation. "You have managed to insert yourself and your organization into a legal and family matter that has significant history you are not aware of. I understand the impulse. You helped tonight. That's genuine." His voice was still courteous. The courtesy was now doing the work that a threat would do in a less controlled man. But the best thing you can do for that child is to let the appropriate people handle the appropriate processes. Otherwise, you create complications. "What kind of complications?" Rhett said. "The kind that attract attention to organizations that generally prefer not to be examined closely." A pause. Measured. "The Wolves run a garage on Merchant Drive. They have permits. Those permits are reviewed annually. That review can be accelerated." There it was again. Not a fist. An institution. The king's preferred weapon when the target was someone who could actually fight back. "The card said 6 a.m., Rhett said. Grayfield's courteous expression held for exactly one more second. Then it released. Not into anger, not into alarm, but into something colder and more fundamental. The expression of a man who has just recalibrated from manageable to problem. "Where did you get a card?" he said. "You gave it to me." "I gave you a business card." "You gave me a business card and a message on the back," Rhett said, written by someone who was in a hurry and didn't think through the handwriting. The waiting room was very quiet. Ms. Doherty had stopped her phone call. The two other civilians present, a young man who'd been waiting with a bandaged hand, an older woman with a magazine she wasn't reading, had both achieved that specific stillness of people who have realized they are in a room where something is happening and are trying to be furniture. Grayfield looked at Rhett. "You should think very carefully," he said, "about what you're doing." "I'm thinking about it right now," Rhett said. "I've been thinking about it for 2 hours." His phone went off. He didn't look at it, kept his eyes on Grayfield, but from his peripheral vision he saw Santos across the room look at his own phone, then look at Rhett with the expression that meant important. Then Patterson came through the entrance doors fast, not running, but close. "3 vehicles, Patterson said, low and direct. "Just pulled into the far end of the lot. Killed their lights when they turned in. 2 cars and a pickup. They're not parking." Everything in the room reorganized around those 2 sentences. Grayfield took one step backward, small, involuntary. The step of a man recalculating the shape of a situation he thought he controlled. How many? Rhett said to Patterson. Can't confirm. At least 6, maybe 8. Ruby was on her feet. Rhett didn't think about it. He crossed to her in 4 steps and crouched in front of her, and she was already looking at him with those green eyes that were frightened now. Genuinely frightened, the real kind. The kind that gets through the composure because it's too large to be managed. And he put both hands on her shoulders, steady and solid. Listen to me, he said. You are not moving from this room. Santos does not leave your side. Nothing happens to you in this building. What's outside? She whispered. People who made a mistake. What mistake? He looked at her. They thought we'd be gone by now. He stood up and looked at Santos. Santos had already positioned himself between Ruby and the entrance, 220 pounds of absolute intention, his face carrying the expression it carried when the situation had moved past the point where expressions were necessary. Wires outside, Santos said. I know. Rhett looked at Grayfield. Grayfield was standing with his tablet in one hand and his phone in the other, and the look of a man who has set something in motion and is now watching it arrive earlier than scheduled. Call them off, Rhett said. I don't know what you're referring to. Call them off now, or I walk out there and have a conversation with them that you will not be able to manage afterward. Mr. Mercer, you have about 90 seconds before this becomes something that cannot be walked back. Call them off. Grayfield looked at his phone, then at Rhett. The calculation was visible this time, not concealed, because there was no longer a point in concealing it. He was doing the math of exposure, of escalation, of what a hospital parking lot altercation at 4 a.m. with an outlaw motorcycle club would do to the tightly managed legal architecture he'd been building for 8 weeks. He put the phone to his ear. He turned away. Rhett watched his back and listened to the half of the conversation he could hear. Yes, I know. Hold position, I said. Hold. Don't move until I... And he felt the specific controlled fury of a man watching the mechanism that was supposed to destroy him being told to wait while the man holding it decided what to do. His own phone was vibrating in his pocket. He pulled it out, a number he didn't recognize, Cookville area code. He answered. Mr. Mercer. A woman's voice, older, shaken in the specific way that people get shaken when they have been operating on bad information for a long time and something has just cracked the container. My name is Margaret Voss. I'm 40 minutes from Knoxville. Someone called me tonight, a woman named Claire. She told me some things about my attorney that I... A breath. Uneven. I need you to keep my grandchildren safe until I get there. I don't know who to trust in that building. Rhett closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Claire had called her. Claire, who had called him to warn him, had also called the grandmother directly, had bypassed Grayfield completely. He opened his eyes. Drive straight to the main entrance, he said. Don't call Grayfield. Don't stop in the parking lot. Drive to the entrance, get out, and walk directly inside. Is Ruby... She's safe. She's right here. A sound on the line that was not quite crying and not quite relief, but was the thing between them that has no name. The sound of a woman who has been searching for something for 2 months and has just been told it still exists. 40 minutes, she said. I'll be here. He put the phone down. Outside, the 3 vehicles in the parking lot had not moved. Wire and Patterson were standing between the Harleys and the vehicle line, visible, stationary, making no aggressive movement and no retreating one, just present. The Iron Wolves parking lot geometry. You want to come through, you come through us first. Grayfield had ended his call and turned back around. His expression had completed its journey from courteous to cold to something that was neither, something purely operational, the face of a man running numbers. My client's grandmother is coming, Rhett said. She'll be here in 40 minutes. At that point, whatever legal leverage you've been using her to carry stops working. He paused. What happens in the next 40 minutes is your decision. Grayfield looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at his tablet, then at his phone, then at Ms. Doherty, who had watched the entire preceding exchange with the face of a woman who had arrived expecting a straightforward welfare check and had ended up in something she was going to need to write a very detailed report about. You have no idea, Grayfield said quietly. what Shannon Calloway took. The words landed differently than anything else he'd said all night. Not a threat, not a legal maneuver, something more fundamental. The frustration of a man who believes the other person in the conversation doesn't understand the true scale of the situation. "Tell me," Rhett said. Grayfield looked at him. "She was a bookkeeper at the corridor room for 14 months. A pause. She kept very good records." The room went ice cold. Records, not physical records. Nobody kept physical records anymore. Digital, portable, the kind of thing that could be transmitted, copied, used. The kind of thing that, in the hands of a federal prosecutor, would dismantle 8 years of carefully constructed financial architecture and put names on indictments that had spent years eluding indictment. Shannon Calloway hadn't just run from the Kings, she had run with their ledger, and she had been sitting in a small white house on a secondary road outside Knoxville for 3 years, hemorrhaging quietly, raising 2 children alone, waiting to see whether they'd find her before she found someone she trusted enough to give it to. Ruby was looking at Rhett from across the room. She couldn't have heard the conversation, but she was reading his face, the same way she read everything, the same way she'd read Decker's guilt and Grayfield's assessment and the shape of every adult interaction she'd navigated tonight. And what she found in Rhett's face made her own face do something he'd never seen it do before. She looked for just a moment like a 9-year-old. Afraid? Young. Small in the orange plastic chair with her wet yellow raincoat and her Velcro sneakers and her hands in her lap, and the weight of something she had been carrying for 3 years without knowing she was carrying it, pressing down on her with its full and terrible mass. The entrance doors opened. Patterson came through fast, and his face was the face of a man delivering information under time pressure, and he said 3 words that reduced everything else in the room to secondary priority. "They're moving in." Rhett turned. Through the glass of the entrance, visible in the orange wash of the parking lot lights, the 3 vehicles had begun to move, slowly, not rushing, the deliberate controlled movement of people who have decided that the waiting is over and the next phase has begun. 6 men. Maybe 8. Moving toward the hospital entrance in the gray pre-dawn with the specific purposeful quiet of people who have done this before and expect it to be finished quickly, Rhett looked at the waiting room, at Ruby, at Santos, at Ms. Doherty with her clipboard, at Grayfield with his tablet, at the 2 civilians who were now very much aware that they were in a room where something serious was about to happen. He looked at the clock. 4:47 a.m. He looked at his hands, the enlarged knuckles, the slightly crooked fingers, the hands of a man who had spent decades pulling weight. Then he looked at the door. And Rhett Mercer, ex-EMT, road captain of the Iron Wolves, a man who had spent 11 years believing that the best thing he could do with his life was survive it quietly, walked toward the entrance of a hospital in Knoxville, Tennessee at 4:47 in the morning with 8 men coming the other direction, and he felt, underneath the fear, underneath the fury, underneath the cold and the exhaustion and the weight of everything the night had cost, he felt, for the first time in 11 years, absolutely certain that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Behind him, the doors swung open, and the Iron Wolves came through them. The first man through the parking lot entrance was big. Not Iron Wolves big, not the kind of big that comes from decades of physical labor and road living and carrying weight that isn't always measurable in pounds. This was constructed big, the kind that comes from a specific and deliberate program, maintained with the cold consistency of someone who thinks of his body as a professional instrument. He had a jacket without patches. The Kings didn't wear their colors on operations like this, another thing that separated them from clubs like the Wolves, another data point about the nature of what they actually were. And he moved with the controlled economy of someone who had done this enough times that urgency had been replaced by procedure. He stopped when he saw Rhett. Not because Rhett was alone. He wasn't. Patterson and Wire had flanked immediately, and behind them, coming through the entrance doors in the same rippling chain as they'd killed their engines on Route 11W 4 hours ago, the remaining Iron Wolves spread across the hospital entrance canopy in the pre-dawn dark. 7 men, Decker included, Decker, who had taken his position on the left without being told, without being asked, who had made a choice about what his presence meant tonight that was separate from and more expensive than anything words could have managed. The big man looked at the line of leather and chrome and did his own calculation. Behind him, 5 others had stopped too. The 7th, the one who'd stayed at the vehicles, hadn't moved. Rhett noted him. The one who doesn't move is either the least committed or the most dangerous. In his experience, it was usually the latter. Hospital property, Rhett said. Knoxville PD covers this lot. We're just visiting, the big man said. Visiting hours start at 8. A pause. The parking lot dripped. Somewhere in the distance, the first birds of pre-dawn were making their tentative assessments of the lightening sky. The specific few-note sounds of creatures who have learned to test the morning before committing to it. We have business inside, the big man said. You have a lawyer inside, Rhett said. That's different. The man looked at him with the flat appraisal of someone recalculating options. He was not afraid. Or if he was, it was the managed professional kind that didn't translate into behavior. He glanced at Patterson, at Wire, at Decker, whom he appeared to recognize, which was its own category of information. This is going to get bad for you, he said to Rhett. Not a threat exactly, more like a weather report. Already bad, Rhett said. We're still here. 10 seconds of absolute stillness, the kind of stillness that has weight and temperature. The parking lot held it the way spaces hold sounds after the sound has stopped, the shape of it remaining after the substance was gone. Then the man's phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something crossed his face, controlled displeasure, the expression of a professional receiving instructions that conflict with his own assessment of the optimal action. He looked at Rhett one more time. Then he turned and walked back toward the vehicles, and the 5 others turned with him in the way that a single organism turns, and within 90 seconds all 3 vehicles had reversed out of the lot, and their taillights had disappeared into the gray dark of the Knoxville pre-dawn. Wire exhaled. What just happened? Rhett looked at his phone. 1 text. Grayfield's number. 2 words. Smart enough. He pocketed the phone. Grayfield had called them off. Not out of conscience, not out of fear of the Iron Wolves specifically, out of the cold arithmetic of exposure. 8 men in a hospital parking lot at 4:50 a.m. on a night when photographs were already circulating on social media. When a DCS worker was inside taking notes. When a grandmother was 40 minutes out and no longer operating through his managed channels. The ledger of risk had tipped past the point where the operation made sense. They would recalibrate. They would try again, through different mechanisms, at a different time, with a better constructed approach. That was what organizations like the Kings did. They were not impulsive, and their patience was one of the things that made them dangerous. But tonight, in this parking lot, at this hour, they had decided the math didn't work. Rhett turned back toward the entrance. Inside, the waiting room had reorganized itself around the aftermath of tension, the specific reconfiguration of a space where something almost happened and didn't, where the air still carried the charge of it. Ms. Doherty was standing near the nurse's station with her clipboard pressed against her chest and the expression of a woman who was extensively revising her report in real time. The young man with the bandaged hand had left at some point during the preceding 20 minutes. The older woman with the magazine was still there, holding it without reading it, her eyes finding the middle distance with the careful focus of someone who has decided that looking at anything specific in this room would constitute involvement. Grayfield was packing his tablet into a bag. He didn't look at Rhett when Rhett came in. He zipped the bag with the precise movements of a man who is performing composure rather than experiencing it, and he picked it up and settled it on his shoulder. And then he did look at Rhett. One look, level and final, carrying something that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite warning, but existed in the territory between them. Margaret Voss is going to want a new attorney, Rhett said. People change attorneys all the time, Grayfield said. Make it easy for her. A pause. Grayfield adjusted the strap of his bag. The records Shannon kept, he said quietly, are going to surface eventually, with or without our involvement. You understand that. That's not my problem tonight. It will be someone's problem. Then someone will deal with it. Rhett held his gaze. Somewhere that isn't a hospital waiting room with a 9-year-old 20 feet away. Grayfield looked at Ruby, who was looking back at him with those green eyes that had been reading rooms and people and the space between what people said and what they meant for 9 years of a life that had not been gentle with her. He looked at her for exactly long enough to constitute acknowledgement, and then he looked away, and he walked to the entrance and pushed through the doors and was gone. The waiting room breathed. Ruby turned to Rhett. "Is it over?" she asked. He sat down beside her, thought about the answer with the seriousness the question deserved. "For tonight," he said. She processed that. "But not for good." "No, not for good. There are things your mom is going to need to deal with. People who are going to need to know about what she knows. That process is going to be... It's going to be hard." He paused. "But she won't be doing it alone." Ruby looked at her hands. "She's been doing everything alone for 3 years," she said. "I know. She didn't have to." Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was doing heavy work. She didn't have to do any of it alone if she'd just... She stopped, started differently. "My grandma. Is she actually nice?" "I don't know her," Rhett said. "But she drove through a rainstorm in the middle of the night without calling her lawyer first. That says something." Ruby considered this with the gravity she applied to all information. "Okay," she said finally. Small word, large weight. The first real light of dawn found the hospital windows at 5:23 a.m. Not dramatic, not golden, just the slow gray increment of night becoming less, the world's most patient transition. It came through the glass at an angle that caught the chrome of the bikes in the parking lot and made them briefly luminous, and Rhett watched it happen through the window with the specific awareness of a man who has sat in enough waiting rooms through enough long nights to understand that dawn is not a resolution, but it is, at minimum, a boundary. The night ends. That matters even when the day is uncertain. Margaret Voss arrived at 5:41 a.m. She came through the entrance doors the way people come through doors when they have been traveling towards something for a long time and have finally arrived. Not fast, but with the compressed, coiled energy of motion that hasn't fully stopped. She was 63, with white hair cut practically short and the hands of a woman who had spent decades in classrooms and gardens and the physical work of an ordinary life lived seriously. She was wearing a rain jacket over clothes that had clearly been put on in a hurry, mismatched in the way that happens when dressing is secondary to the urgency of departure. She saw Ruby before she saw anyone else. The room contracted around that moment. Ruby stood up from her orange plastic chair slowly, and she and her grandmother looked at each other across the waiting room for the length of time it takes for two people to confirm that the other person is real and present, and actually there. Margaret's face did what faces do when something that has been held against loss for a long time finally gets to release. Not prettily, not with dignity, just honestly, the way grief and relief look when they arrive at the same moment. She crossed the room and she put her arms around Ruby, who had held herself together through a highway and a dying mother and a premature baby and a CPS interview and a lawyer carrying threats and men in a parking lot. And hours in a fluorescent waiting room, Ruby let go. Not for long. 30 seconds, maybe. The specific duration of a child allowing themselves to be, for a brief window, the size they actually are before they put the structure back up. Rhett looked at the ceiling. He was aware of Santos beside him making no sound and making it loudly. He was aware of Hatch near the door turning to look out at the parking lot with great apparent interest in the lightening sky. He was aware of Patterson and Wire and the others doing various versions of the same thing, the collective masculine performance of not watching a moment that deserved privacy. When he looked back, Margaret was holding Ruby at arm's length, looking at her face with the cataloging attention of someone checking for damage, finding mostly exhaustion and residual composure and the green eyes that had clearly come from somewhere in this woman's lineage. "You stopped motorcycles," Margaret said. "They stopped," Ruby said. "I just stood there." Margaret looked up and found Rhett. He was prepared for the assessment to take time, for the leather and the patches and the face to do the work they always did, the delay, the recalculation. Instead, she looked at him for about 4 seconds and then crossed to him and put her hand out and he shook it. And her grip was firm and her eyes were direct and she said, "Thank you. I don't have words for it, but I mean that completely." "She's a remarkable kid," Rhett said. "She's had to be." Margaret's voice was level, but it carried the particular sadness of a woman who understands that the remarkable thing about her granddaughter is partly the product of circumstances that should never have existed. "Shannon, they told me she's stable." "She is. They're limiting contact still, but the doctor said she's going to be okay." Margaret nodded slowly. the nod of someone absorbing good news carefully, not wanting to grip it too hard before it was fully confirmed. And the baby, NICU, small but fighting. Another nod. Her hand was still in his briefly, and then it wasn't, and she looked at Ruby again, and the look contained everything she couldn't say in a waiting room at 5:41 in the morning. Ms. Doherty appeared with her clipboard. The conversation that followed between the DCS worker and Margaret Voss was the kind of conversation that has paperwork at its center and human beings on its margins, and it took 40 minutes, and by the end of it, a temporary emergency guardianship framework had been established that would allow Ruby to leave the hospital with her grandmother while Shannon's recovery continued and the legal picture clarified. It was incomplete, and it was imperfect, and it would require more work in the coming days and weeks, but it was enough. For now. For this morning. Ruby received the information about where she was going with the composure she brought to everything, and then, when the paperwork was set aside and it was clear that the official conversation was over, she turned to Rhett. "My grandma's house," she said. "Is it far?" "Cookville. About an hour." "Will I be able to come back?" Her voice was careful, precise. "To see my mom and James." "James," he repeated. "You named him." Something moved through her face, the first thing all night that was purely, uncomplicated, warm. "My mom said she couldn't decide. I decided. James was my grandpa's name." A pause. "Is that okay?" "That's more than okay." She looked at him for a moment, doing the thing she did, reading him, calculating, deciding something. "Will you be here?" she asked. "When I come back." He looked at her, at the yellow raincoat that had dried overnight into a slightly stiff approximation of its original shape, at the Velcro sneakers, at the face that had held itself together through the longest night of her 9 years with a steadiness that most adults couldn't manufacture. "You know where to find us," he said. She nodded, accepting this. Then, without ceremony, she crossed the 2 steps between them and put her arms around him, briefly, tightly, with the determined precision of a child who has decided that this action is necessary and is going to complete it regardless of how it looks. And then she stepped back and went to stand beside her grandmother and did not look back at him, because she had what she needed, and she knew it, and she was already oriented toward what came next. Rhett stood with his hands at his sides and let the moment be what it was. The Iron Wolves left the hospital at 6:15 a.m. Not all at once, ones and twos the way they'd arrived in pieces through the night, movement reconfiguring around the new shape of the morning. Santos left first, something quiet and unreadable on his face that Rhett didn't push on. Patterson and Wire together, with the easy silence of men who had been through something and would process it privately and perhaps never discuss it directly, and would understand it between them anyway. Hatch stopped beside Rhett at the entrance. "Federal level," Hatch said. "Shannon's records. If they're what Grayfield implied." "Not our call," Rhett said. "Shannon makes that call when she's able to make it. And if the Kings come back before she's able?" Rhett thought about the 3 vehicles in the parking lot, the 7 men on the line, the card with its deadline that had come and gone without the promised consequences, because the math had shifted before they could collect. "Then we're available," Rhett said. Hatch nodded once and walked to his bike and started it, and the sound of the engine in the early morning air was the most natural sound in the world, low and rolling and entirely without apology. Decker was last. He was leaning against his bike with his arms crossed and his eyes on the horizon, where the sky had committed itself to becoming day, the gray having lightened to something that would be blue eventually, if the clouds cleared. He didn't look at Rhett when Rhett stopped beside him. They stood like that for a moment. The sound of the remaining engines dying, the morning birds, the distant ambient hum of a city that had been sleeping through everything and was only now beginning to surface. "Chapter decides," Decker said. His voice was flat and quiet and had accepted something. "Chapter decides," Rhett confirmed. "I'll stand for whatever they—" "Decker," Rhett stopped him. Not gently exactly, but not harshly either, with the specific directness of someone who has made a decision and doesn't need the conversation to be longer than it needs to be. "Kyle's staying out of prison." Decker was silent. "What you did put people in danger," That's real, and it's not gone, and you're going to answer for it in front of the chapter. A pause. But you did it for family. That's also real. And after 17 years of watching you hold this club together through everything it's been through, I am not going to stand in front of the chapter and tell them that you're something you're not. Decker's jaw worked. Once. You should, he said. Probably, Rhett agreed, but I'm not going to. The morning light moved across the parking lot in its slow, indifferent way, reaching the chrome of the Harleys and finding it, briefly, extraordinary. Decker finally looked at him. His eyes were the eyes of a man who has been braced for a blow and received something else instead, and doesn't entirely know what to do with the difference. You're a difficult man to have as a road captain, Decker said. I know, because you make it hard to stay angry at you. I know that too. A beat. Then Decker pushed off his bike and put his hand out, and Rhett took it, the grip of two men who have been through something together that neither of them will fully articulate for years, who carry it instead in the specific way that men carry the things that matter most, quietly, heavily, and without putting it down. They rode back through Knoxville as the city was starting, not in formation, scattered, individual, 11 different routes converging loosely on the general direction of the Merchant Drive garage where the day's work would eventually begin and where the chapter meeting would eventually be called and where the accounting would eventually take place. The morning was cold and bright in the particular way of October mornings after a storm. The air scoured clean by the rain, the colors of things vivid against the pale sky, the world looking briefly like a version of itself that had been repaired overnight. Rhett didn't go to the garage. He rode to a diner on Central Avenue that had been there since 1987 and had never updated anything about itself except the menu prices. And he parked and went inside and sat at the counter and ordered coffee and eggs that came with toast he didn't ask for, and ate them at 7:15 in the morning while the breakfast crowd moved around him and nobody looked twice at the leather jacket or the gray beard or the cut with its worn patches. Just a man eating breakfast. The coffee was bad in the specific way that diner coffee on Central Avenue had always been bad, which is to say it was hot and abundant and tasted like the idea of coffee more than coffee itself, and it was exactly what the moment required. He thought about Ruby in a car heading to Cookeville, her yellow raincoat probably left somewhere in the hospital, her grandmother driving with both hands on the wheel, and the particular careful attentiveness of someone transporting something precious. He thought about a baby under lights in an NICU, being watched over by people whose job it was to watch, which was its own form of guardianship. He thought about Shannon Calloway waking up in a hospital bed to the knowledge that her secret was no longer only hers, that whatever came next was going to be harder and more public than the 3 years of managed hiding she'd managed so far, and also that her children were safe, and that her mother had driven through the night to reach her. He thought about Emma. He thought about her the way he always thought about her, so not in narrative, not in story, but in image. The particular way she laughed with her whole face, the small, serious frown she wore when she was working something out, the weight of her when she fell asleep in the car, and he carried her inside, the specific gravity of a sleeping child in your arms that you don't understand the value of until it's gone. She would be 20 years old now. He tried sometimes to imagine who she would have become and found that he couldn't, not because the imagination failed, but because whatever she would have been was hers to have been. And it was enough to know that it would have been something real and particular and worth knowing. He thought about what Ruby had said at the hospital before everything accelerated, in the quiet moment in the waiting room when she'd looked at him with her impossible green eyes and said, "She would have liked the man you are now." He'd thought, when she'd said it, that she was talking about his daughter. Sitting at the counter of the diner on Central Avenue with bad coffee and good eggs, he wasn't sure that was what she'd meant at all. He thought she might have been talking about a man that Rhett himself had stopped believing existed. The man underneath the road captain, underneath the 16 years of distance and noise and chosen exposure to other people's emergencies. The man he'd been before the accident and had been trying to find his way back to ever since, on a road that kept going without a clear destination. He didn't know if that man was retrievable, but he thought this morning that looking for him was less exhausting than it had been yesterday. His phone went off. An unknown number, Cookeville area code, the same one as before. He answered. "Mr. Mercer," Ruby's voice, steadier than it had any right to be at 7 in the morning after the night she'd had. "My grandma said I could call." You okay? I slept in the car. A pause. She has a dog. His name is Walter. He's very old and he smelled my shoes for a long time when we came in. Rhett set his coffee cup down. That's a good sign. She's making breakfast. Real breakfast. She has a pan that she said belonged to my great-grandmother. Another pause, different texture to this one. The sound of a child encountering the unexpected evidence that she belongs somewhere, that the belonging predates her knowledge of it. She has photos of my mom from before. Her voice was quieter. She was really young in them. People are, Rhett said. A silence. Comfortable. The kind that doesn't need filling. My mom's going to be scared, Ruby said, when she wakes up all the way and finds out about Grayfield and everything. She's going to be scared. Probably. Will you? She stopped, started more carefully. The garage, on Merchant Drive. Is that close to the hospital? He understood what she was asking. 12 minutes, he said. Okay. A breath. Okay. That's okay. He could hear, in the background of the call, the sound of a kitchen operating. Pans, movement, a dog's nails on a floor, the ambient evidence of a house that had been waiting to be full again and was tentatively, carefully beginning to be. Ruby, he said. Yeah. You did good last night. A pause so long he thought she might have put the phone down. Then, you too. She hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. The diner moved around him. Short order noise, coffee refills, the comfortable ordinary percussion of a morning that had no idea what the night before had contained. 2 booths over, a man was reading a newspaper with the focused intensity of someone conducting a formal relationship with print media. Near the door, a woman in scrubs was paying her check and already reaching for her keys before she'd finished. Outside the window, Central Avenue was waking up in its incremental way. First the delivery trucks, then the early commuters, then the slow drift of the city toward its daily shape. The sky had clarified overnight into something that might, by afternoon, be genuinely blue. 19 days later, Rhett heard that baby James Calloway had come home from the NICU. He heard it from Ruby, who called on a Saturday morning with Walter barking in the background and her voice carrying something new in it. Not the exhausted composure of the night on Route 11W, but something younger and less defended. The voice of a child who is cautiously, carefully beginning to trust that good things can maintain themselves beyond a single night. He drove to the hospital, not alone. The Iron Wolves lined the parking lot in the bright October morning, engines off, a stillness that was different from waiting, the stillness of arrival, of having gotten somewhere and stopping to market. 11 bikes, 10 men, plus the 11th who had taken his chapter accountability with the same quiet he'd applied to everything and was working his way back through it, present and flawed and still there. Shannon Calloway came through the hospital doors in a wheelchair she didn't need anymore but hadn't been cleared to refuse yet, carrying her son in both arms with the particular fierce tenderness of a woman who has spent 19 days watching through NICU glass and is only now being allowed to hold what she was protecting. She stopped when she saw the bikes. She stopped when she saw Rhett. He had not met her before. She was younger than the night had allowed him to imagine, early 30s, pale from the weeks indoors, with dark circles and the specific, carefully assembled composure of someone who has been told things while in a hospital bed that would take months to fully process and has decided in the interim to simply be upright and moving. She looked at him with the eyes that were not Ruby's green but held the same quality. That particular depth of someone who has been looking at the world from behind glass for a long time and is only now deciding whether it's safe to stop. "You're Mercer," she said. "Yeah." A pause. She looked at the bikes, at the men, at the patches and the leather and the 10 faces that had collectively decided that whatever this morning required of them, they would provide it. "Ruby talks about you," Shannon said. "Ruby talks about Walter mostly." Something moved through her face. Not quite a smile yet. The precursor to one. The muscle memory of smiling reactivating after a period of disuse. Walter's easier to explain to people. He looked at James in her arms. Tiny. More present than his first reports had suggested possible. Alert in the vague, serious way of newborns. Engaging with the October light with the grave curiosity of someone conducting their first formal assessment of a world they've been promised is worth entering. "He's got your eyes," Rhett said. Shannon looked down at her son. The precursor smile completed itself. Quiet and real and costing her something. The way genuine expressions cost people who have been careful with their faces for a long time. "My mother says he has her father's chin," she said. "Your mother's not wrong about much." Shannon looked at him steadily. "I know what you did. Not just that night, the week since." She paused. The words had weight that she was clearly measuring carefully, deciding how much to hand over. "I know what you've been doing at the house." The Wolves had been at the Calloway house. Not formally, not with announcement, individually, in ones and twos in the gaps between their regular days. New boards on the front steps, the gutters reattached and properly sealed, the porch light replaced. A winter's worth of firewood stacked neatly against the side of the house by Santos, who had said nothing about it to anyone and would have denied it if asked directly. The leak in the roof above the bedroom that Ruby had mentioned in passing during one phone call, addressed by Wire and Patterson on a Thursday afternoon with materials Rhett had purchased and not discussed with the chapter. "We had the time," Rhett said. Shannon looked at him for a long moment with the measuring look that was apparently hereditary in the Voss women, the look that could read the space between what was said and what was meant, and was deciding how to respond to both simultaneously. "I have to talk to federal investigators next week," she said. "My attorney, my actual attorney, not—" She stopped. "The one my mother helped me find. She says it's going to take months, maybe longer." "I know. It's going to attract attention." "I know that too." She looked at the bikes again. At the men who had ridden on a cold October morning to stand in a hospital parking lot for a family they'd met in a rainstorm 19 days ago, for no reason that could be explained cleanly in the language of obligation or debt or anything transactional. "Why?" she asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. The question underneath all questions about loyalty that has no clear contractual basis. Rhett thought about that. He thought about Route 11W in the rain, about a yellow raincoat in the dark, about the specific weight of a sleeping child against your arm and the feeling rising through the ribcage like water finding its level, of something that has been locked for 11 years quietly, carefully, deciding to open. "She stood in the road," he said, "in the middle of everything. And she didn't run." Shannon looked at him, then at her son. Then at the October sky above the hospital parking lot, where the clouds that had been building all week had finally cleared and left something clean and cold and genuinely blue behind. "Neither did you," she said. Rhett said nothing. Because some things don't need a response. Because the morning was there and the sky was clear, and the baby in Shannon Calloway's arms was looking at the world with the grave open attention of someone who has decided, provisionally but sincerely, that it might be worth the trouble. He looked at his hands, the enlarged knuckles, the slightly crooked fingers, the hands of a man who had spent decades pulling weight that belonged to other people and had decided, somewhere along a route that had no clean beginning, that this was not a burden but a direction. He looked at the line of bikes in the parking lot, at Decker, who held his gaze for a moment with the acknowledgement of a man still working through his accounting, still present, still there. At Hatch and Santos and Patterson and Wire and the others standing in the October light with the easy, uncomplicated presence of people who have decided that this is where they belong today, which is all any decision ever needs to be. He looked at Ruby, who had appeared in the hospital doorway behind her mother. Walter temporarily surrendered to her grandmother's keeping, standing with her hands in her pockets and her face doing the new thing it did now, the cautious, considered, slowly practicing expression of a child learning that mornings can sometimes be okay. She looked at him. He lifted one hand. She lifted one hand back. And Rhett Mercer, ex-EMT, road captain of the Iron Wolves, a man who had spent 11 years learning to carry what the road had taken from him, stood in a hospital parking lot in Knoxville, Tennessee, on a cold and clear October morning and felt the weight he'd been carrying shift, not disappear, not resolve, not become something other than what it was, but redistribute, the way weight redistributes when more hands reach for it. Not criminals, not heroes, just men who had stopped when it mattered and stayed.